The breakfast room of Ashbourne Hall held 43 people on the morning of the 3rd of October, 1814, and every one of them heard the sound that Lady Harwick made when she rose from her chair. It was not a word. It was the sound a person makes when they have seen something they were certain belonged to the dead. Dorothea Voss had been the Countess of Ashbourne for precisely 2 hours and 20 minutes. She sat at the head of the long table on her husband's right, her ivory gown reflecting the October light, her gloved hands steady in her lap, because she had trained them to be steady in rooms where she did not belong. The brooch was pinned at the high collar of her Spencer jacket, where it had been every morning for the past 3 years. It was a small thing, oval and silver-backed, with a painted eye at its center, a lover's eye in the old fashion, the iris worked in tiny seed pearls that caught whatever light was near. Her father had pressed it into her hands 2 weeks before he died, and she had worn it every day since, as a kind of argument against the world, as proof that she had once been loved. Lady Harwick stood at the far end of the table. She was 67 years old, and had the bearing of someone who had never needed to raise her voice to command a room's attention. She did not need to raise it now. The conversation died in pieces as the guests registered her face, and then the direction of her gaze, and then what hung at Dorothea's collar. "That brooch," Lady Harwick said, "was placed in my sister's hands when she lay in her coffin." The room did not breathe. Dorothea felt her husband's hand go very still on the table beside hers. She could not look at him. She looked at Lady Harwick instead, at the white knuckle of one hand pressed to the tablecloth, at the expression on the old woman's face that was not fury yet. It was the expression that comes before fury. It was recognition. "It was not buried with her," Lady Harwick continued, her voice carrying without effort to every corner of the room, "because it was stolen first." The October light poured in through the long windows. The wedding breakfast sat untouched on 36 plates. Candace. Dorothea's hand moved of its own accord to the brooch at her collar, and she felt the small oval of it beneath her gloved fingers, warm from her own skin, familiar as her own heartbeat. She had been a solicitor's daughter in the market town of Millhaven for the first 20 years of her life, which was long enough to understand that the world divides cleanly into those who are asked to explain themselves and those who are not. Her father had understood this too, in the gentle and melancholy way. He understood most things. He had kept a modest practice in a town that produced modest business, and he had raised Dorothea on books he could not always afford, and on the principle that a woman's intelligence was her only portable property, and so it was worth cultivating carefully. He died in the spring of 1811, when Dorothea was 20 years old, and he left behind a small house, a modest library, a practice that a man named Philip Crane had offered to manage on her behalf until she came of age, or married, and a brooch, pressed into her palm in the last days, his voice dropping to something she had to lean close to catch. "From your mother's family," he had said. "Keep it close." She had done exactly that. Her Uncle Philip had arrived at the house in Millhaven on the 2nd day after the funeral, which was fast enough to suggest he had been waiting. He was her father's younger brother, a man of 45, whose pleasantness always seemed to cost him something, as though he had calculated the exact social return on every smile, and gave exactly that much, and no more. He managed her father's small affairs with efficiency, and made regular mention of how those affairs had been rather more tangled than expected. She was never shown the accounts. She was told, frequently, that she had nothing to recommend her by way of fortune, and that she should hope her other qualities were sufficient to secure a respectable match. The word "nothing" had been used about her so often in her uncle's household that she had grown a kind of callous over the place where it landed. She was 3 months past her 22nd birthday when she came to Ashbourne Hall as a companion to Mrs. O'Tay. Letitia Marsh, a cousin of the Earl's by some remove, who required someone to read to her in the evenings and to carry her parcels in the village and to sit beside her at dinner when the company was light. The position paid £12 a year. Dorothea had accepted it, without deliberating longer than was necessary. She had expected Edmund Voss to be what she had been told he was, which was formidable and cold and recently widowed and unlikely to notice the woman carrying Mrs. Marsh's parcels. She had not expected him to be quiet. She had not expected the quality of attention he brought to a room, the way he seemed to take the full measure of everything in it, without performing the act of looking. She had not expected to be part of that measure. The first time she had reason to speak to him directly was in the small parlor on a Tuesday morning in November, when her uncle had come to Ashbourne on some errand she did not fully understand, and had spoken sharply to one of the housemaids, a girl of 16 named Mary, accusing her of taking a cameo pin from Mrs. Sixterio. Marsh's dressing table. Mary had not taken it. Dorothea knew this because she had seen Mrs. Pord. Marsh placed the pin herself in her jewel case the previous afternoon, and she said so in the parlor, with her uncle's eyes on her, and Edmund Voss standing at the window, with his back to the room. Philip had smiled at her. It was the calculated smile. "My dear," he said, "you are very certain for someone who was not present." "I was present," Dorothea said. "I was sitting beside her when she put it away. The pin is in the green jewel case, in the lower left compartment. If someone will look, the matter will be resolved. The pin was found where she said it would be." Mary was released with a nod. Her uncle's smile did not change, but something behind it went cold in a way. Dorothea recognized tea. She had not registered that Edmund was no longer at the window until she turned and found him standing 3 feet from her, watching her with an expression she did not yet have a category for. He did not speak. He simply looked at her for a moment the way a man looks at something he has been trying to identify for some time, and is now placed. Then he excused himself and left the room. She learned later from Agnes Tully that he had stood in that window the entire time, that he had heard every word, and that he had not intervened because he had wanted to see what she would do. She had not known she was being tested. She did not know, at the time, what she had passed. It was a winter engagement, hastily enough arranged that the county's opinion was divided on his motives, which was to say that half the county assumed the worst, and the other half assumed the second worst. Her uncle came to Ashbourne to deliver his consent, with a face that gave nothing away, and stayed long enough to congratulate her with such warmth that she felt cold the rest of the day. Lady Harwick, reached by correspondence, expressed the view, through her companion, that the Earl of Ashbourne's judgment had perhaps been impaired by his grief. This opinion circulated in the drawing-rooms of 3 counties in the weeks before the wedding. To the drawing-rooms, Dorothea Crane was the girl with nothing to recommend her. She heard it once, directly in the village, from Lady Harwick's companion, Miss Fenton, who had not seen her in the doorway of the lending library and said it in a clear undertone to a friend. That sort of girl with nothing to recommend her, and the Earl who could have had Cecily Vane, Anderson, who was beautiful and correct, and whose family had been aligned with Ashbourne for 2 generations. Dorothea had stood in the doorway of the lending library for a moment with her hand on the doorframe, and then she had gone in and selected her books and walked home without altering her pace. The brooch was at her collar on her wedding morning, as it had been every morning for 3 years, and the day had seemed to be going as well as she had been able to hope, which was to say quietly and without incident. Until Lady Harwick's chair scraped on the breakfast-room floor, and 43 people turned to look at the thing pinned at the new Countess of Ashbourne's collar. Dorothea did not move. The hand at her collar fell back to her lap. She could hear the fire in the grate behind her, and the sound of someone setting down a glass too carefully, and, very distantly, the wind in the elms at the edge of the drive. Lady Harwick was moving toward her. She was not a woman who moved quickly, but she moved with the authority of someone who had never in 67 years needed to move quickly, because rooms had always made way for her. The guests on either side of the table shifted their chairs fractionally outward as she passed. Cecily Vane, seated 3 places down the left side, kept her eyes on her untouched plate with the stillness of a woman choosing very carefully not to be involved. "My sister Constance died in the winter of 1811, Lady Harwick said, and her voice now carried something almost conversational, which made it worse. She was laid out in the yellow room at Harwick Park. Her personal effects were catalogued by her lady's maid and placed on a tray on the dressing table, to be distributed according to her wishes. She stopped at the corner of the table nearest Dorothea. That brooch was among them. I saw it on the tray myself. I was with Constance through that entire week, and I know her things as I know my own face. Dorothea looked up at her. She did not know what she looked like from the outside in that moment. She knew only what she felt, which was the specific cold of a floor giving way. The following morning, Lady Harwick continued, the brooch was gone. The maid was questioned. The household was searched. We concluded it had been taken in the night, though by whom we could not prove. My sister was buried 3 days later without it. She paused. And now it appears to be decorating the collar of the girl with nothing to recommend her, who has married my nephew at speed, in a small ceremony, with rather less society present than the occasion warranted. The room had not breathed for some time. Edmund's hand on the table was very still. Dorothea did not look at it. She looked at Lady Harwick. The brooch was given to me by my father, Dorothea said. She heard her voice from a great distance, level and quiet. He told me it had been in my mother's family. He placed it in my hands 2 weeks before he died. Your father, Lady Harwick said, who was a solicitor in Millhaven. Yes, and who had dealings, I believe, with the Harwick estate in the winter of 1811, through the offices of a Mr. Philip Crane. The silence that followed had a different quality. Dorothea did not speak. She felt the thing she had been holding at bay come toward her from some interior distance, patient and steady, and she could not make it stop. She did not know. She had risen from her chair. She was simply standing, and then the room was rearranging itself around her as she walked toward the door, and the guests nearest the hall were moving aside, and she could hear the October wind very clearly now through a gap somewhere in the window frame, and behind her she heard Edmund's voice say quietly, "Excuse me." And then the door closed, and she was in the corridor alone. The corridor was cool and dim. The voices in the breakfast room resumed almost immediately, quiet and sustained, the sound of 40 people discovering they had something to discuss. She stood with her back against the paneling and pressed the flat of her hand to her chest over the brooch. Her father's hands had been unsteady in those last weeks. She could remember the specific angle of his wrist as he pressed the brooch into her palm, the way his voice had dropped, as though the words were for her alone. Your mother's family, he had said, and she had believed him the way you believe. A man who is dying of a thing he cannot name, and has only days remaining. Her uncle had been in the house that week. He had managed her father's estate. He had been at Harwick Park that winter, in some professional capacity, she now understood, which was a fact she had not previously had reason to consider. He had given the brooch to her father as a token from her father's effects, arriving in a small cloth parcel 2 weeks before the funeral, with an explanatory note in her uncle's handwriting. She had never questioned the note. She had been 20 years old, and newly orphaned and grateful, for anything that felt like her father reaching toward her from across the distance his illness had already imposed. She heard footsteps in the corridor, too light to be Edmund's, and pressed herself further against the paneling. The footsteps slowed and stopped, and she heard Mrs. Duracken, Pemberton, the magistrate's wife, speaking to someone just around the corner, her voice too low to fully carry but certain words arriving cleanly through the paneling. The girl with nothing to recommend her. Mrs. Price, Pemberton was saying. And what had Ashbourne expected? And it was a great deal of unpleasantness for a marriage that had always been considered imprudent by anyone who cared to think carefully about the matter. Dorothea stood very still. She had known she was considered imprudent. She had known the drawing rooms had their conclusions. She had believed, in the private way she never articulated even to herself, that Edmund's choosing her was stronger than those conclusions, that his certainty would make a different weather. She was wearing his name. She was standing in his house. And the world had found, in the space of 2 hours, the one instrument it needed to revise that certainty. The cold was in her chest now, spreading in the way cold does when it has been invited in without resistance. She thought of the morning which had begun at 5 o'clock in a room at the top of the house, with a fire already laid by a maid whose name she did not yet know, and the ivory gown laid out across the chair, and the feeling she had had while dressing, quiet and serious, that this was a thing she was choosing in full knowledge of its difficulty. She had not been afraid of the difficulty. She had been afraid only of hoping more than was wise. She had not been wise enough, apparently. She had let herself hope quite a great deal. She heard the sound of a door opening, somewhere at the far end of the corridor, and then quiet footsteps that she knew. She had learned Edmund's footsteps in 3 months at Ashbourne without intending to. The way you learn the sounds of a house you have come to care for. He walked the way he held himself, steadily and without haste, as though he had decided where he was going before he began. He came around the corner and stopped when he saw her. He did not speak immediately. She had noticed early that he did not fill silences with words simply because they were there, and she had understood later that this was not coldness. It was the habit of a man who had learned to wait until he was certain. He looked at her face, then at the brooch, then at her face. Again, "I need to speak to Agnes Tully," he said. It was not what she had expected. She had expected something that required her to answer, some form of question or requirement she would need to navigate with what was left of her composure. She had not expected him to name his housekeeper. She was there, he said. In the winter of 11, she went to Harwick Park with the Marsh household when Constance Harwick was taken ill to assist with the nursing. She was there the week of the laying out. Dorothea looked at him. "I remembered it just now," he said. When Lady Harwick described the tray, Agnes mentioned it once in passing, that winter, that she had seen your uncle take something from a tray in the yellow room, and that she had not known what it was, and that she had not liked the way he moved across the room when he thought he was unobserved. He paused. "She told me this more than a year ago. She said she did not know if it meant anything. I had no reason, at the time, to believe it meant what it means today." Dorothea felt something settle in her. Some interior machinery that had been turning very fast, and now slowed. "She has not been asked," Edmund said, "until now." He was already moving toward the servants' passage at the far end of the corridor. She watched him go. His coat was dark, his cravat precisely arranged, and he walked with that same particular quality of settled purpose that she had noticed in November, in the parlor when he stood at the window and watched her defend Mary to her uncle. He was a man who waited until he was certain, and then he did not wait. At all, Agnes was found in the linen room above stairs. She was a woman of 52, with gray at her temples, and the careful manner of someone who had learned to observe precisely and speak only when her observations were wanted. Edmund did not find it necessary to lead her to the answer. He asked what she had seen in the yellow room at Harwick Park in the winter of 1811, and she told him, in her particular careful way, that she had seen a man remove a small brooch from a tray of grave goods, while 2 of the housemaids were briefly occupied in the next room. She named him plainly, without drama, in the way she named most things. She had thought it strange at the time. She had said nothing because there was no one to say it to, and the man in question had the confidence of someone who does not expect to be questioned. She described the brooch precisely. The oval silver back, the painted eye, the seed pearls. Edmund thanked her, and went down the servants' stairs without explaining what he intended, and when Agnes called after him to ask if she was needed, he said she would be, very shortly, and that she should come to the breakfast room in 10 minutes. He came around the corner to where Dorothea was still standing with her hand over the brooch and her back against the paneling. He stopped in front of her. His expression was not the expression of a man who had resolved something. It was the expression of a man who was about to resolve something and was measuring the distance to it with care. "Agnes saw him take it," he said. "She can say so in front of Lady Harwick and the room. She can say so precisely with the detail that is required to be believed." Dorothea looked at him. She found, to her own surprise, that she was not crying. She had expected to be crying by this point. She was instead feeling something that had the quality of ground solidifying underfoot after a long stretch of uncertain footing. "Philip will deny it," she said. "Philip will deny it," Edmund agreed. "And then I will ask him to explain why he sent a cloth parcel to your father's house in December of 1811, 2 weeks before your father died, containing a brooch that he had removed from a tray of Constance Harwick's grave goods. And I will observe that a solicitor's correspondence tends to leave traces that a man of business does not always remember to account for." She looked at him for a long moment. "You do not know that he sent correspondence?" she said. "No," he said. "I do not. He does not know that I do not know it. A man who has done what he has done tends to believe the evidence is always closer than it is." The breakfast room door was audible from the corridor. As a sustained low sound, 40 people making careful conversation in the presence of something they had not expected this morning. Dorothea straightened her back and adjusted the brooch at her collar. She felt the small oval under her fingers warm and familiar, and thought of her father's hands unsteady in those last weeks, and the way his voice had dropped. She had not needed to question the note. She had simply loved him. Edmund offered her his arm. She took it, and they walked back to the breakfast room together. He did not knock. He opened the door and entered with the particular quality of a man reclaiming a room that is his, and she was beside him. And the conversation did not die this time so much as it absorbed them, the way a room absorbs an event that it has been waiting for. Lady Harwick was seated again at the far end of the table. Miss Vane was still studying her plate. Her uncle stood near the window, a glass of something untouched in his hand. And when Edmund entered, his eyes went to Dorothea's collar, and then to Edmund's face, and then to the glass in his hand in that order. Edmund walked the length of the room. He did not stop at his own place at the head of the table. He stopped in front of Lady Harwick. "I owe you an account," he said. Lady Harwick looked at him. She was not a woman who softened easily, and she did not soften now. But she gave him her attention with the completeness that suggested she considered him worth attending to, which was its own form of courtesy. "My housekeeper," Edmund said, "was present at Harwick Park in the winter of 1811, in attendance on the Marsh household during your sister's illness. She was present during the laying out of your sister's effects." He paused. "She will be here in a moment to tell you what she observed on the morning the brooch disappeared from the tray." The room had gone entirely quiet. Even the fire seemed to withhold itself. Agnes came through the door at the far end of the room with the unhurried steadiness of a woman who had been asked to do something and had come to do it. She stood near the door and looked at Edmund, and he nodded, and she described in plain, clear words what she had seen in the yellow room at Harwick Park. The tray on the dressing table, the 2 housemaids occupied in the next room, the man who had crossed the floor with the specific silence of someone who did not want to be heard, and the brooch that had been on the tray when she last looked and was not on it afterward. She described the man. She described the brooch. There was a sound from the window. Philip had set his glass on the sill with the care of a man managing the use of his hands. "This is," he said, and his voice had the pleasantness in it still. The calculated pleasantness, but something underneath it had shifted into the register of calculation unmoored from certainty. "This is a servant's account of something she believes she saw 3 years ago." Edmund turned toward him. "It is," he said, "and I am prepared to accept it. And I believe Lady Harwick is in a position to corroborate the description of the brooch in sufficient detail to satisfy any reasonable inquiry." He paused. "I am also prepared to inquire, through my solicitors, into the correspondence that passed between your offices and this estate in late 1811, as well as the correspondence between your offices and the household of the late Mr. Robert Crane. Records of that kind tend to surface when looked for with sufficient care." Philip looked at him for a moment. His face did something under the pleasantness. It was not the same thing that a guilty man's face does when he is caught, which tends toward the dramatic. It was quieter than that. It was the face of a man who has been playing cards and understood several moves before the end. which direction the game has turned. "I see," Philip said. He set the glass down with a small, precise sound. Edmund turned back to the room. He turned back to Lady Harwick, whose face had undergone its own alteration, some complex internal calculation arriving at a result she had not expected. "She is my wife," Edmund said. "And the brooch is hers." Not loudly. Not as a declaration that required an audience, though it had one. He said it the way he said most things, level and certain, as though the matter were already resolved, and he was simply making the resolution audible for the benefit of those who had not yet caught up. The silence that followed had a different texture from the silence that had accompanied Lady Harwick's accusation. That silence had been the held breath of a room waiting to see something fall. This silence was the silence of a room watching something that had been falling decide instead to hold. Lady Harwick looked at the brooch for a long moment. Then she looked at Dorothea, and Dorothea looked back at her, and something in Lady Harwick's face, some calculation she had been running since the morning she arrived, reached its end. "Constance would have given it away freely," Lady Harwick said at last, to no one in particular. "She was always giving things away. It was, I always thought, her finest quality and her most considerable inconvenience." It was not an apology. Dorothea had not expected an apology. It was something more accurate than an apology. A correction offered by a woman whose categories had turned out to be wrong in a specific way, and who was honest enough to say so in front of the room that had heard her certainty. Miss Vane rose quietly from her place, offered a brief courtesy toward Edmund, and made her way to the door, with the dignity of a woman who understood precisely when a room had finished needing her. Her uncle left before the breakfast was cleared, in the company of a brief word from Edmund that Dorothea did not hear and did not need to. She sat in her place at the head of the table and watched the room settle, watched the guests find their voices again in the gradual tentative way of people reassembling after a weather event, watched Agnes return to her duties with the slight straightness of someone who has been asked to do a difficult thing, and has done it to her own satisfaction. Edmund came back to his place beside her and sat down. He did not say anything immediately. He poured a small amount of wine into his glass and held it, and she could see, at this close range, the specific quality of stillness he had when he was working something through. The nearly imperceptible shift in his jaw, the way his eyes went somewhere private for a moment before returning. She had learned that quality of stillness in 3 months of living in the same household and paying careful attention to a man she was not supposed to be paying careful attention to. She had catalogued it along with the way he moved when he was certain of something and the way his voice went lower, not louder when the matter at hand was serious. She had told herself she was simply being observant in the way a companion is observant about the household. Where she works, she had not quite believed herself then. She believed herself even less now. "Your wife," she said quietly. Not the calibrated line he had spoken to the room. Just the word, held up like something she was still examining. He looked at her. The corner of his mouth moved in a way she had come to understand was what passed for considerable feeling in a man who had learned to carry that feeling very close to the chest. Constance was one of Philippa's godmothers, he said. He did not say the name with preparation. He said it the way he might say a name he had not spoken aloud in some time, and was choosing, now, to say, "My first wife." She died in the autumn of 1811, 3 weeks before I received Lady Harwick's letter about the brooch. He paused. The season after that was not a kind one. There were things said about her that I could not answer, because the people saying them were certain, and certainty is a difficult thing to argue against once the room has accepted it. Dorothea held very still. "I could not answer for her," he said. "I learned, this morning, that I could answer for you." She understood, in the particular way she understood things that arrived with the force of things she had always half known. That this was as much as she would be given by way of explanation today, and that it was precisely enough. He had been shaped by a loss he could not have prevented, and by a silence he could not have broken. He had waited until he was certain, and then he had not waited at all. Outside the long windows, the October elms were in the last of their color, and the light had moved around the corner of the house to fall at a slant across the tablecloth. and it caught the seed pearls of the brooch at her collar in the way certain light catches certain things, briefly and specifically, as though pointing. The breakfast room gradually became what it had been meant to be: a meal, a gathering, the ordinary ceremony of an ordinary wedding morning, conducted with the slightly elevated quietness of people who have been through something together and are deciding collectively not to speak of it directly. Lady Harwick remained at the table. She ate sparingly, and spoke to her companion in undertones, and did not look at Dorothea often, but when she did, the expression on her face had changed from what it had been when she entered. Something in it acknowledged, without quite naming, that she had been wrong, in the way she had chosen to be wrong, which was to say with the full confidence of her position, in front of witnesses. Dorothea accepted a plate of things she could not taste, and held her wineglass with a steady hand, and kept her eyes on the table, and let the morning reconstitute itself around her. It was only later, in the private sitting room attached to the larger apartment that was now hers as well as his, while the sounds of the guests' carriages drifted up from the drive below, and Edmund was engaged with some final courtesy to the departing household, that she removed the brooch from her collar and held it in her palm. The painted eye looked up at her. The seed pearls were very fine. Constance Harwick, whoever she had been in her full life, had owned beautiful things. Dorothea thought of her father's hands and the angle of his wrist and the specific drop of his voice, and she understood now that he had not known what he was giving her. Philip had given the parcel to him in the last weeks of his illness, when his mind was still clear, but his body had already begun the slow work of leaving, and he had passed it on as something to hold to, something from the long line of her she had never quite been able to see. He had believed what he was told, because he was dying, and he wanted something to give her. She had believed what she was told, because she wanted something of him to keep. Neither of them had been wrong. They had been deceived by a man who understood how much it costs to hope, and who had used that cost deliberately. The fire had been laid in the grate and was burning in the low, steady way of a fire that expects to be kept company. The window gave onto the elm avenue and the October afternoon, and the light was going the way October light goes, reluctantly and in stages, the elms holding their last color against the coming gray. She turned the brooch over in her palm and thought as clearly as she had thought anything today, that she did not know yet what Constance Harwick had been like, or whether she would have given the brooch away, as Lady Harwick seemed to suspect she might. She thought that she would in time perhaps learn. Lady Harwick was not a woman who would become warm. She was, however, a woman who recognized honesty when it was placed in front of her, which was its own kind of opening. The door opened, and Edmund came in, his coat still perfectly arranged, his cravat unchanged, looking precisely as he had looked at 7 that morning when they had stood in the church together, which she found, under the circumstances, obscurely moving. He sat down in the chair across from hers and looked at the fire for a moment, and then at the brooch in her palm. "I should have told you about Constance before today," he said. "I had intended to." "You had not found the right moment," she said. He looked at her. "No. Nor had I told you about my father," she said. "About the last weeks. About what I have been carrying in the way of questions I did not know to ask." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the last carriage was on the drive, the sound of it diminishing toward the gate. The fire settled and sent a small, bright thread of light across the hearthrug. Philip had died believing the world had made up its mind about her. He said, it was simply stated. It had the quality of something said exactly once, without preparation, as the truth tends to sound when it has been held too long and is finally released. I could not change what the world had decided. I could not make it see what I saw. That is the thing I carried. Dorothea looked at him for a long moment. She thought of the woman whose name she had known for 3 months as a careful absence in the household. The portrait turned to face the wall in the upper corridor, the piano in the small sitting room that no one played, and no one covered, as though to cover it would be to admit it was no longer in use. She had not asked, she had understood, in the peripheral way she understood most things about him, that there was a loss in the house that had not resolved itself into grief yet, and that she was not the person to resolve it. What was she accused of? Dorothea said. It was not a question exactly. She already understood the shape of it from what he had said. She asked because she thought he had been carrying the answer in silence for 3 years, without anyone having the patience to ask him to set it down. He looked at the fire for a moment. Nothing. That was true, he said. The season had a version of her that suited the season. I could not argue it into a different shape. I was young, and I did not yet understand that the truth does not need my argument. It needs only to outlast the season's attention. He paused. She did not live to see it outlast anything. I did not need the world to see, she said. I needed you. Something shifted in his face. He reached across the small distance between the chairs and took her hand, the one that was not holding the brooch, and held it. Not a gesture of comfort exactly. Something more deliberate than that. The deliberate clasp of a man who has decided where he is and intends to remain. The room was very quiet. The fire spoke in the grate. The elms beyond the window held their color against the failing light. Dorothea looked down at the brooch in her palm. Then she moved it, not back to her collar, but lower, to the place just above the line of her Spencer jacket, over her heart, and pressed it there against the wool, feeling the warmth of the painted eye through the fabric. She did not know what Constance had been. She did not know what would come of Lady Harwick or of her uncle, or of the particular version of the world's opinion that had been spoken in the breakfast room this morning. She knew that there was a fire and an arm's length of quiet between herself and a man who had learned to wait and then had not waited, and outside the window the last of the October elms. She held the brooch against her heart and let the afternoon come down. If Dorothea's morning moved you, leave a word in the comments. And stay close, for the next story is already waiting in the quiet.